So looking at the footage of Insulate Britain activists doing their level best to provoke the public, one of the things that's come out of that story, for want of a better term, is the response of the police. And I think the optics of that are not particularly good. It really didn't help that when the M25 protests were going on, there was a policewoman, I assume she was a senior officer, literally going in front of the row of activists, asking them if there was anything they would need. And she laughed, in a sort of jovial, friendly way. Now, there may have been a strategy to that, but I think the optics were bad. I think the public saw that, and, there's been similar situations where they basically look like they're negotiating with them. Even in the central London protests, they were um, asking them if they knew they were breaking the law. Now, I appreciate that legally they have to read out the rights. I have no problem with that. But I think the optics are not good. I really think the optics are not good. Um, so rather than talk about Insulate Britain, because I've spoken about them enough, you know, I can't promise I won't speak about them again, but for now at least, I want to focus on the police. This is actually an extremely important issue because in a democracy, and in this democracy, we have policing by consent. And it's been that way really since the police, in their modern form, were established under Sir Robert Peel circa 1850s. There was predecessors, of course, of Bow Street Runners and others, but essentially the modern police has its origins in about the 1850s, I believe, or 1830s. And the logic of this is that the public sort of entrust people to wear a uniform, to impose a law, to arrest criminals. That's essentially, when you strip everything back, that is essentially the purpose of a police officer, to impose a law, to arrest criminals. That is essentially what it's about. There's a lot of other things as well, but that's essentially it. But I really feel that in recent years, there has been a big decline in public trust of the police. Now, maybe this is true of institutions in general. I think if you would look at social attitudes, perhaps, let's say the 1950s, I think generally trust in institutions, lots of institutions, was higher around that time. This is not to say that society was better, but I think we live in a cynical age. And the thing is, it's not unfounded. I do believe the police are partly responsible for this themselves. And I'm going to come to that in a minute, but to kind of add weight to what I'm talking about here, I want to read out a case that I think just highlights this point. And there's a few angles to it, so bear with me. This is BBC reports. It doesn't say who the journalist is. It's a BBC report, and the headline is this: Bristol priest loses faith in police over loud wedding party row injury. So I'll just read out the report. It's not very long. A parish priest said he has lost faith in police who failed to investigate when he was hurt on church grounds in a dispute over a loud wedding party. Father Colin Mason of Sacred Heart Church in Westbury-on-Trim, Bristol, says he was attacked by four guests when he complained the party overran. However, two partygoers said Father Mason, excuse me, was hurt as he fell being escorted out. Well, if you see the accompanying picture, and I'll put a link to this, that looks very dubious. They clearly look like injuries of an assault. Even in Somerset, police acknowledged Father Mason's complaint and said it was reviewing its service. Father Mason said that while initially helpful, even in Somerset, police did nothing to investigate the dispute, in which he sustained a fractured eye socket. I imagine he'll need medical treatment for that. The image is quite unsettling. There's blood all over his shirt. It's quite unpleasant. He said on the night of the attack on the 20th of August, the church hall had been rented for a Hindu wedding, with the agreement that it would be at 10, that it would end at 10 o'clock BST. When he said loud music could still be heard more than an hour later, he went to the hall to ask them to end the party. Four blokes bundled me outside, and one of them beat me up, so I was lying on the grass covered in blood, he said. But two partygoers told the BBC Father Mason acted like a lunatic and was swearing and cursing to turn the music down after the wedding overran by 40 minutes. Party attendees initially thought it was a racist attack, as Father Mason entered the building in a dressing gown and was not identifiable as a priest, they added. All I can say about that, I can't second guess what they were thinking, but one individual on a party, it's a little bit dubious, just a little bit. One of the partygoers told the BBC the priest sustained his injuries from a fall while being escorted out by wedding guests and not from the punches, adding they apologised at the time for upsetting him. Um, well, if they overran the time, this is my words, they had no business escorting him out. I mean, that is dubious in itself. It's his church, or rather, he's a presiding clergyman of the church. Father Mason confirmed to the BBC he was wearing civilian clothes, but said the rest of the partygoers' claims were simply false. He said, I told them they had to close the party, at which point they attacked me. I fell after being dragged outside and beaten up. The claim that no punches were thrown is laughable given the blood all over my face and the fracture to the left eye socket, he said, adding they did not cooperate with the police. The police said the initial police response was good, with four officers attending to close the party down, and an ambulance was called to take him to Southmead Hospital. However, he said officers promised to follow up by taking down the name and contact details of the person who booked the party. But he heard nothing and contacted the police more than a month later to be told the case had been filed. It doesn't give you confidence in the police if they're not prepared to investigate violent crime, said Father Mason. He has now written a letter of complaint asking for the case to be reopened, saying, I feel a lack of trust in the police, my confidence is gone. And even in Somerset, police spokesperson said the complaint had been passed to the area patrol inspector and the force could make no further comment until the review had concluded. I think their excuses are a bit thin, to be honest. Here we have a man who, in all probability, was a victim of a violent assault. Now, granted, it's his word against the party guest, but if you look at the photograph, that does not look like an injury from falling down. It's clearly an injury in his eye. It clearly looks like a punch. Um, and even if he had perhaps been less diplomatic than he implies, even if he had been shouting, there's absolutely no reason to assault someone. And this business of escorting him out, I mean, even if that's true, that's very arrogant of the guests. I mean, they're renting a Christian place of worship. They're Hindus. It's not illegal. That's okay. But I think what's probably happened here is some of the guests, whether they were drunk or whether they were just stubborn, um, they just didn't like the fact this guy was telling them to turn the noise down, and they took it out on him and they committed violent assault. He is a victim of violent crime and he deserves justice. Now, the fact that he had to follow up a month later is a disgrace. This is a serious crime. We're not talking about a minor thing here. Um, so for the police to sort of pass the buck and say, "Oh well, we've passed it to an area inspector. We can't say anything further," it just seems that they're causing this victim of crime unnecessary stress. Um, I've been in a similar situation. Um, when I was studying in Wolverhampton, I went to university in Wolverhampton, 2005. Me and a group of friends were walking past the ring road. Anyone that knows Wolverhampton, there's a ring road there. And basically, a group of guys approached us and demanded money. And because I'd had previous experience of crime, I was a little bit reckless and I instinctively said no, piss off, or something to that effect. Because I was just like, no, I'm not going to be walked over. I'm not giving these guys money. Probably a bit reckless on my part because they could have had knives or anything. I was maybe a little bit reckless, but I just don't like being walked over. So anyway, they laid into us. Thankfully, whether they were high on drugs or drunk, they didn't do that much damage. The coordination wasn't great, so it could have been worse. But anyway, I went to the police station to report the incident. Thankfully, they didn't take much. I don't think they got anything, in fact. But the officer who dealt with me was totally unsympathetic. Whether he was having a long day or what, he was totally unsympathetic, and I basically lost my temper, and I ended up writing a complaint. I think at that time it was the Independent Police Complaints Commission, because I really felt as a victim of crime I should have uh, had more sympathy. I just felt that the officer's whole attitude was dismissive, and I do think that police sometimes forget that they deal with crime all the time. It's a job. A victim of crime is going to be in a state of shock. A victim of crime is going to be angry, is going to be anxious. And considering they are often the first responders, I think they really, really need to be trained in sympathy. I think it's one thing that's sometimes overlooked. And it's extremely important. So, frankly, I think the police need to have some flexibility. Maybe a victim of crime is a bit on edge. Maybe they're shouting, or, the police need to understand that. But getting back to this incident in Bristol, I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. But looking at the picture, I believe the father. I see no reason why we'd make this up. Um, it just makes no sense. Why would he put himself through the stress of filing a complaint if he was just making it up? That's nonsensical. And it really, really shouldn't be hard to identify the people responsible for this. Simple. Get a wedding list. I mean, it's not like he was attacked in the street and, he couldn't identify the assailant because it was dark or something like that. This was at a specific venue, his church. Just get a list of the wedding guests and investigate that way. I honestly believe, and this is purely speculation on my part, I can't prove it. I honestly think this is just a case of, well, we have a situation here where you have a Hindu wedding. The victim happens to be white. You don't want a racial thing here, so let's just sweep it under the carpet. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. I am not for a second saying this was a racist attack, because the report says nothing about the assailants using racial slurs, which would indicate that it would be racially motivated. So, it's very possible if a British Indian asked them to turn the music down, they would have laid into him as well. So I'm not suggesting it was a racist attack, but I do believe, my gut feeling is there is double standards. Put it this way: had a Hindu temple rented out to a white wedding party, I don't know if that happens, but let's say it does, and let's say the proprietor of that temple complained that the wedding ran over time, and let's say you got some thugs decided to lay into him. Now, I am convinced that the approach of the police would be different. It's a gut feeling, I can't prove it, but I believe they would be absolutely all over that because they wouldn't want to be accused of ignoring a minority person being attacked. I think because the victim's white in this case, um, they're sort of thinking it'll just be swept under the carpet. Now, I don't want to be inflammatory. I cannot prove that. I'm not stating that as a fact, but I just think there are double standards. Um, Ultimately, assault is assault. Regardless of who the victim is, assault is assault. But I don't understand why Avon and Somerset Police are taking the attitude they are. How hard can it be to narrow down a wedding list? Even if it's a big wedding, even if it's 500 guests, at some point you're going to narrow that down. It's a lot easier to narrow that down than, say, the whole city of Bristol. So I don't really understand their excuse. But this really taps into a wider problem. Here you have a victim of a violent crime who's being left with bureaucracy. He is now in a situation where he's first of all had the stress and the ordeal of being a victim of violent crime. Now he's having the stress of having to go through the complaint procedure with the police. That's ridiculous. And I know from experience it's bureaucratic because you're basically, although it's independent now, I believe that was one of the best things New Labour brought in. But you know, victims of crime still have to go through bureaucracy, and it's not just victims of crime. Anyone who's making a complaint about the police, perhaps unlawful arrest, it should be as straightforward as possible. And I honestly think the police need to accept that they're in a position of power, therefore they have to be accountable. No, I don't like criticizing the police. I think they're in a difficult job. And it's a pretty mediocre salary for what they do. It's a difficult job. They do face real dangers, but it's not good enough to just say, well, they're in a difficult job, so people shouldn't complain. No, I don't really buy that. I think that it gets back to this issue of policing with consent. I mean, I want police officers who are empowered to arrest criminals and take action against criminals. What I don't want to see is police negotiating with eco extremists whilst failing to really act against, support a victim of violent assault. Okay, they initially helped him, but why did it then just get forgotten? That's ridiculous. Um, and I do frankly think there are times the police don't help themselves. I mean, when they have ridiculous billboards, Merseyside police had this a while back, it is illegal to be offensive. They literally had a billboard advertisement saying that. They quickly had to apologize and accept it was a mistake. Um, Nonsense like that. The Woke Olympics, going out of the way to show how diverse they are, or um, knock someone's door because they've used the wrong pronouns online. I personally think there is far, far too much policing of online content. What I mean by that is obviously online, sometimes people are unpleasant, right? Sometimes unpleasant things are said. But unless there's a specific threat, I really don't think that online issues should be investigated by the police unless there's a threat. If someone is threatening, for example, a public official with violence, then absolutely that should be investigated, especially with what's happened recently in Southend. So yeah, that should be investigated. But I do question police priorities, frankly, and this has particularly been the case during COVID. I mean, the Sheffield Force, South Yorkshire Police, I should say, they went into a man's lawn because he was sitting outside, and they harassed him over supposedly breaking COVID restrictions. Except he wasn't, because he wasn't in a crowd. Um, he wasn't breaking any of the rules as they were at the time. And again, South Yorkshire Police had to apologise afterwards. I know that they're human. I know mistakes can be made. But every single time these things happen, it erodes public trust. Because I fear there's a situation where you have criminals and offenders on one hand, the police on another, let's imagine it like a triangle, and the law abiding public on another. Okay? The police and the public should be on the same side. The police should be arresting criminals, they should be sympathetic to victims of crime. In return, law-abiding members of the public should have enough confidence to go to the police and to assist the police. But I fear that it's not a triangle; it's like a freeway situation. So there's going to be differences force to force. No doubt some forces are better than others. But is it too much to ask that if someone wears a uniform, they they should expect to be safe in their line of work. They should expect to get the resources they need. And in that regard, they need support from the Home Office. I think Tory cuts have not helped, but I think that's only part of it. I don't think that is the only reason. Um, I mean, really, there is no excuse for police taking a long time to turn up to a bunch of extremists causing danger on motorways. I don't see any rational reason why they shouldn't be acting immediately. Um, I think police need to understand that a victim of violent crime needs reassurance that their case is being taken seriously. And this case is by no means unique. It really isn't. I mean, I appreciate they probably have a lot of paperwork to go through, but surely a violent assault should be a priority. I mean, I appreciate if someone is a victim of theft, it's unpleasant, but that isn't going to be a priority in the same way as violent assault. But nevertheless, it's all about optics. And I'm not anti-police. I respect the police, but I think sometimes they're their own worst enemy. I really do. I think they need to appreciate that the public are not being unreasonable in their expectations. They're really not. It's so hard to expect that they act against violent criminals, and often they do, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes, someone is a victim of violent crime, or you have serious antisocial disorder going on, antisocial behavior going on, and they take ages to arrive. Yet, like I say, someone uses the wrong pronoun online, they'll get a police knock on the door. I think it's a disgrace, quite honestly, and it's not good for democracy when you have this extent of mistrust. And I sympathise with individual officers. I imagine there are many police officers, individuals, who are just as frustrated as the public, and they want there to be more action. And no doubt there's a lot of good things go on. No doubt there's many, many acts of heroism from police officers all the time. And they maybe think, well, why isn't this being recognised? But it shouldn't really be a case of, well, give us credit for all the good things we do, because it is their job, actually. I mean, it should be acknowledged, but it is their job ultimately. Um, I mean, nurses and doctors save lives, and they've rightly been recognised during the pandemic, um, but they're not recognised all the time. I personally think emergency workers, nurses, ambulance drivers, police officers in general, they all deserve a pay rise. Um, but I think when it comes to the police, I do think they're partly culpable for the decline in public trust. There's too much bureaucracy. I think sometimes they're a bit too defensive. An example of this is the minister, the notorious Plebgate affair a few years ago. Andrew Mitchell. Now that just got blown out of all proportion. I believe what happened there is you had a government minister who lost his temper. He shouldn't have done that. He called in an officer a pleb. He shouldn't have done it. But it got totally blown out of proportion. And the Metropolitan Police wasted so much time on that. So much time. Um, it really shouldn't have got to that extent. So I think they need to get their priorities right. Um, that's one way to restore public trust. I mean, I've assisted police officers. I remember last year, there was a guy who I thought had been a victim of assault. He was just a drunk, basically. He was basically hanging upside down on a park fence, and it was a cold night, so I took him down because he would have got hypothermia or something. But then he turned on me. Anyway, his girlfriend or a woman that knew him thought they'd been stabbed. She called the police, and when they turned up, they just asked for my statement. And yeah, I kind of assisted them in that sense. But I've also worked with PCSOs as a community support liaison. So I've got some experience of working with police. I respect them generally speaking. Incidentally, I'll just quickly add this: I've zero respect for officers who abuse their position. I think corrupt officers, I think officers who are unnecessarily brutal, they absolutely, not only should they be sacked, I think they should be arrested. That's another issue. I don't think we have the same problem as the States. I really don't, so I don't want to make comparisons. However, the Sarah Everard case is showing that there are clearly some rotten apples in the police force. And I think that officers who abuse their power, um, whether it be using unnecessary force, whether it be, for example, using their power as an officer to exploit a woman. Uh, there's different situations that can and do happen. And I personally think it's not good enough to just put that officer on desk duty. That's something that I really have no respect for. Don't put them on desk duty, arrest them. There cannot be double standards. There really cannot be double standards. An officer who abuses his or her power, simply putting them on desk duty is basically how that comes across to me is, well, this is unwanted attention from the media, so we're just going to investigate this and hope it goes away. No, if there's sufficient evidence, obviously with the evidence, arrest them. Police officers should not be above the law. If anything, they should be upholding the law, should be setting a good example. Anyway, I'm going to round this up, but I just think that when someone's a victim of crime, the last thing they need to be going through is bureaucracy. The last thing they need to be going through is add insult to injury on top of being a victim of crime, they then have to deal with police incompetence, quite frankly. Um, it's not good enough. And I'm not saying the police are 100% to blame. The government certainly takes some blame for their cuts. But nevertheless, decisions that police forces make are often with the superintendent of that force. So the buck does stop with them in some ways. And I think sometimes the priorities are just wrong. I think they need to set an example. I think they need to be proactive, but they need to be proactive in the right area, not harassing ordinary people over trivial matters. They need to be proactive in arresting criminals. Okay, that really isn't unreasonable. I don't think the public is being unreasonable. That's all. And I think addressing these things, really addressing them, could restore public trust. There are times I side with the police, incidentally. For example, recently they advised women not to go out alone, and they were accused of victim blaming. I don't think that was victim blaming. I think that was reasonable advice. So there are times I will back the police and side with them, but I think more often than not, honestly, they're responsible for a decline in trust because of some of their actions and their priorities. Let me know your thoughts.